Welcome to Similarities and Differences of ADHD and Executive Dysfunction. I am so excited to be here. This is one of those topics that fills my heart and soul with joy. And we have some amazing expert panelists with us today who are going to walk us through some of the burning questions that we have around the topic. We'll do some introductions. I'll give a brief, I promise, brief overview into Learnfully and our mission, our service, our offerings. And then we'll talk a little bit about LD Awareness Month. We'll open it up to the expert panelists. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A in the chat. We'll try to answer those live, but if for some reason we don't get to it or we run out of time because we have quite the robust discussion today, then I'll make sure that I personally circle back with you afterwards. So still drop those questions even if you feel like we might not be able to answer them. All right, without further ado, I am Jess Corinne. I am Head of Educational Services here at Learnfully. I started my career as a classroom teacher, super excited and energized to dive into the classroom, quickly realizing that I was ill-equipped to serve each and every one of the learners in the way that they needed and deserved. And so I took charge and moved back home after college and joined forces with Linda Mood Bell Learning Processes, where I truly feel wholeheartedly that I refined the art of multisensory evidence-based implementation. I served as a clinician, a consultant, a school services director. I was a regional director for some time. And then I spread my wings, opened my private practice, and gained a whole lot more training in programs like Orton Gillingham, Wilson Reading System, social thinking, you name it. I am a mother of 4 as well. I became a teacher before I had children, and now I have 3 neurodivergent out of 4. The 4th is a toddler. So you can guess it's in his DNA. So I feel like I've been gifted. I'm so grateful that I'm on this career path because I can serve my children and our community as a whole. So I'd like to turn the mic over to Georgia. Please feel free to introduce yourself.
All right. I'm Georgia Bozaday. I'm the Director of Educational Services at Rush University Medical Center, specifically Rush Neurobehavioral Center. I've been in that position almost completing 17 years now. Prior to that, I spent over 3 decades in public schools, starting out in speech and language, and then, early childhood, gifted ed, what was called learning disabilities in those days, and then finishing degrees in administration. Finally ending my career as Director of Student Services and Assistant Superintendent, and finishing a doctorate in curriculum. So then I came to, I know, it's exhausting just thinking about it. Then I came to the current position, which made my heart filled with joy for 2 main reasons. My love is curriculum and instructional design. So I got to plow forward with that wholeheartedly with my colleague, Mike Smith, whom you see here on the panel. And the second reason is I was afforded the opportunity to write grants and use our executive functions curriculum with underserved populations. So, I have two kids. They're 41 and 47, and they're both teachers. Yes.
Victory! That's amazing. That does feel so good as a teacher parent, doesn't it? That's awesome. Thank you for your introduction. Mike, feel free to take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Smith, a education specialist at the Rush Neurobehavioral Center. I've been with RNVC for 15 years now, doing parent and teacher presentations, family EF workshops, and working one-on-one with students as an executive function coach. Prior to my work here, I was the theater arts and public speaking teacher at a West Side Chicago charter school called North Lawndale College Prep, where we had a mission to get students from an under-resourced neighborhood in Chicago into college with the skills that they need to graduate college. So I became very invested in college readiness. Surprise, surprise, it's executive functions that really prepare you for college and careers afterwards. After my work at that school, I joined RNBC, helped to develop the curriculum. I think it's worth noting that I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was in 5th grade. Didn't do a whole lot to to address it with medication until I got to college. And then it became really difficult to do focused work on my own, by myself. And so at any rate, so that's a little bit about me, and pass it back to you, Jess.
Thank you. I'm so happy you're here. I love the personal ad too. That was great. Thank you for sharing. Okay, Sheila, let's do this. My right-hand gal. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Sheila Murphy. I actually came into education a little bit later in life. I always struggled in school, never found it very useful or engaging. And then my own 3 sons were having the same challenges. So along the way, we finally started doing testing and understood that they were definitely neurodiverse learners, struggling with dyslexia, auditory processing challenges, dysgraphia. And so I found myself constantly teaching the teachers how to teach my kids, and I was not an educator at that time. So I decided to go back to school because in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, what happens to families that cannot advocate for their kids? And so that was always just something in my head that I felt like I needed to do something about. So went into education to advocate for neurodiverse learners, specifically in at-risk communities. I was a teacher downtown inner city school, became a instructional coach, and then moved into administration and now consulting. So kind of my journey.
We are so honored to have you too as our educational consultant. She's also an educational specialist and executive functioning coach. So I will toot your horn all day, Sheila, if you will not. All right, let's dive into the main event. So at Learnfully, we always start with why, and our why is our mission and our values. So through these core values, growth, possibilities, community, partnership, and connections, we believe every child learns differently and deserves to learn fully. And so we provide them through our robust and dynamic educational specialist network. We provide them with that evidence-validated multisensory approach to learning in a personalized and differentiated way. So all of our education specialists have a variety, a diversity of training, expertise, credentialing, and charisma to boot, so they can maintain engagement, establish rapport and credibility, and really maximize those gains, expedite progress as a whole. We believe that every caregiver, every educator, anybody who centers around the learner as they are the center of our mission is equipped. And we want to make sure they have proactive and transparent communication at all times. So we're constantly updating the ecosystem, we call it, of support around our learner to ensure that they really have those layers of support as secure as possible, and that they not only reach, yes, we want every learner to reach their full potential, but truly realize what their full potential is, their metacognitive state, learn how they learn best, and feel empowered to advocate for themselves. So our job as educational therapists, as EF coaches, is to truly work ourselves out of a job and really help our learners lean into discomfort, discover their strengths, and then thus reach that potential. So LD awareness, this is our last webinar. We had a weekly webinar series this year. We were very excited about, clearly. And this is LD awareness month. So October, we celebrate learning disabilities. There are 5 core learning disabilities that we celebrate, particularly this month. And those are dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and ADHD. So the finale webinar is dedicated to ADHD. We in the room, at least, the panelists, know that this number, 1 in 5, the 20% of learners who are diagnosed, is quite low compared to the reality of the situation. Most of our learners, they may qualify for a diagnosis, but not have access to that, to assessments, to an IEP. They may not be far enough behind where they necessarily warrant an individualized educational plan. So we want to make sure we're pounding the pavement, we're spreading awareness. We want to make sure that our community really understands that learning difference may or may not have a diagnosis, and that each child really deserves that differentiated and individualized approach so that they can then, of course, have a positive trajectory throughout their educational career and beyond. So ADHD, it's so exciting. So one of my favorite people on the whole planet is Dr. Russell Barkley. And we're going to make sure that when we send the recording after this webinar, that you have links to his resources, Rush resources, our resources. But a lot of my awareness, a lot of my information comes from his work. And he has really been on a mission to really debunk or demystify this impression that ADHD and executive functioning are the same thing. They're not the same thing. Spoiler alert. So ADHD is a diagnosable neurodevelopmental disorder. It is a condition, and we'll get to executive functioning and executive dysfunction in a moment, but is diagnosed. So it is in the DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5, as a diagnosis. It used to be ADD. Now it is ADHD, but they have some criterion. There are 3 types, if you will, most common symptoms to ADHD, and that's inability to attend or sustain attention. So to focus for a long period of time in something that may not be of interest. That's really important to note. Most commonly ignored symptom of ADHD is this one, because our ADHD learners, for the most part, can hyperfocus, right? They can really, really focus on something that's super engaging. So some parents, me included, may look at that as like, oh, they're focused, right? They're sustaining attention. In reality, if it's an unpreferred task, or if it's something that perceived as challenging, then they will not exhibit that same amount of attention span. It's really important to note. Impulsivity. So this is something that I think oftentimes it depends on what's developmentally appropriate for a learner's age and grade. We have milestones. There's developmental markers and milestones online. We'll also support you with those resources. But just because a child at the age of 5 blurts out in class does not necessarily warrant an ADHD diagnosis. There are definitely, this has to happen over, a number of trial periods for a long period of time. And impulsivity has to be outside of the developmental norm for that age and that grade. And then hyperactivity. They're juiced, they're energized, but just because somebody has energy like me doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't the diagnosis, right? So all these have to go, all these learners who have the diagnosis, Mike, I'm sure you experienced it, had to go through a very comprehensive process. Our second week of our webinar series, we talked about those psychological assessments, and they're very comprehensive. And so this is not just something that you observe in a 5-minute trial and you're able to diagnose. It takes a lot of time from experts and professionals to be able to formally diagnose. And then the treatment plan is differentiated based on the learner's needs and those symptoms that were noted. Oftentimes when we focus on ADHD, we focus all about the things that they can't do. And that pains me as a parent of a neurodivergent learner who has ADHD, but someone who probably has it themselves really wants us to focus on interests and strengths. And so I want to make sure that we aren't just focused on the areas of need, although if you do see these 3 most common symptoms, of course, flag your child's teacher, your child's ecosystem of support, your pediatrician, your psychologist, because they can do further testing to analyze if your child warrants the diagnosis. But please, even if you do get the diagnosis, I know it's hard at first. There's a process here. There are so many strengths that I think as a society, we don't necessarily discuss of an ADHD learner. So I wanted to make sure that at least you had this visual representation of this kind of outside of the iceberg of these things that the society thinks that ADHD learners do really well. But in reality, there's so much that's unseen, so many strengths that I really believe this is our opportunity to celebrate everything that they bring to the table. So they may be really good at new hobbies because they can hyperfocus, right? They focus on their interests. They can be engaged. They can be very productive if we incorporate interests and bolster these strengths, collaborative, competitive, and so forth. We'll make sure you have this resource when we share the recording, but I wanted to balance the 2 sides. So there's 3 common symptoms, but there's also so many strengths. Even if your learner doesn't necessarily qualify for an ADHD diagnosis, but shows the symptoms, those strengths really need to be celebrated and incorporated into any instructional plan. So what is executive functioning? These symptoms seem really similar, right? Well, executive functioning is broken down into 3 buckets, if you will, but there's actually 11 skills. And most recently, I heard it described as executive functioning is your brain's ability to move from point A to point B. How do you get through daily operations? How do you get through life? You have to be able to manage your time. You have to be able to self-regulate, be emotionally aware, be self-aware, be able to plan and prioritize, organize your thoughts and your materials. So executive functioning, these symptoms can look very similar to ADHD, and some of them are, and we're going to go into that relationship in a moment. But please know the executive functioning and the lack thereof, the executive dysfunction and ADHD are two separate challenges. Drum roll, please. So let's get into how they're different and similar. So first and foremost, George is going to break down the relationship between ADHD and executive dysfunction so we can clear that up.
So as Jess mentioned, ADHD and executive functions have an overlapping nature. The key piece of this slide that I want to emphasize is relationship. Because I think if we understand the relationship between ADHD and executive functions, we'll be much better prepared to apply executive functions. Because we view, in our work, we view executive functions as tools. They are skill sets, but when you look at what a student needs, a child needs, you're looking at the application of different skills in executive functions. So you see, number one here, has a hard time paying attention. Well, that's true for ADHD. It's true, by the way, for learning disabilities and cognitive disorders. In fact, it is the number one characteristic there. And it is among the top group for emotional and behavioral disorders. So no wonder it's a bit confusing, right? And I'm emphasizing this because the overarching umbrella use for executive functions is very wide. Executive functions are the key to helping all students, regardless of diagnosis or not, with these particular skills, so difficulty with self-control, managing emotions. The social emotional component of executive functions used to be separated out. They used to regard one set for cognitive issues and one set of executive functions for social emotional. And it was about 10 to 15 years ago when the research started to show these are actually combined. These the same skills in executive functions that apply to cognitive challenges also apply to social challenges. So you can see why in the listing for social, emotional, and behavioral issues, many of these same characteristics are repeated. I'm not going to read this whole list. You definitely can read it yourselves. But the idea of how to get started with a task, how to break a task down, how to organize tangible items and tasks you need to do. So these are questions that come up and are answered by the application of executive functions. That's why this relationship and the role that executive functions plays is so important. You know, if we go back to 2005 with the original research from Angela Duckworth and Marty Seligman, you've got grit on your little table, Jess, I noticed that. So
I love Marty and I love Duckworth. Those are two of my top people in life. So thank you for mentioning them.
Of course, I could not do any presentation without talking about their original research. It really kicked off our work and a lot of other people's deep dive into executive functions. Well, that basically in a nutshell, their work showed that executive function skills are a better predictor of success in school than IQ. Oh my goodness, it rocked the academic world. You would have thought that they would have said something horrendous. There were so many attempts to disprove it. People redid their studies over and over and over with the same result. I probably have easily 200 citations after their research that proved the same point. So that elevated the importance of executive functions, but it also begged the question, well, how can we do, can you teach it? Is there anything you can do related to executive functions that will help students gain better skill sets, basically? And that's where that relationship of executive functions as tools relative to these defining characteristics within ADHD and other areas of difficulty, that's where that comes in. So I'm going to leave you, I know I have 5 minutes and I'm sure I've come close to using it up. I'm going to leave you with one statement that it's made frequently. So this is not my own. I recently took a seminar with George McCloskey, one of the big names in executive functions, and he quoted this same statement, but it goes like this. Everyone with a clinical diagnosis of ADHD will have areas of concern that fall into executive functions. But not everyone with executive functions issues will have a clinical diagnosis of ADHD. And I think that, again, that further defines this relationship. And also has frankly been a guiding part of our work as we've written curriculum for classroom implementation that's also applicable for individual and groups of students.
Thank you, Georgia. I appreciate it. And we'll make sure that we highlight those resources that we mentioned in our follow-up email. But that was brilliant. I mean, honestly, you can only take a few minutes if you want, Sheila, but what's the difference, right? Spoiler alert, what's the one difference between ADHD and executive dysfunction?
Yeah, so the difference is that ADHD is an official diagnosis. Executive function and challenges are not necessarily an official diagnosis. And so that's one of the things that you'll most often find when you're maybe dealing with testing in schools, is that you can have some resources. If you do have an official ADHD diagnosis, you may or may not have resources if you have executive functioning challenges. So the other sort of differences is that children with executive function disorders may not be as impulsive. So children with ADHD, you saw the three main ways they are. Things may not carry into the challenges of a student with executive function disorders. They may have trouble getting started, but it doesn't mean that they will be impulsive or inattentive because of it. They may just exhibit it in different ways, like just not starting. So typically the self-regulation, controlling of emotions may come in the form of meltdowns because they're frustrated, but it won't look the same as a student that has attention deficit or hyper disorder. So that will look very different for those kids. So the one thing though that is very clear in all of this, and Georgia just said it beautifully, all students with ADHD will struggle with executive function disorders. So that's one thing that is without a doubt a true
Most
statement.
Certainly, yes.
Most
And
certainly.
it's the way the brain operates, and we could get all into the details about the prefrontal cortex and the synaptic connections. We won't go too far into that, but we have other webinars where we have, so feel free to dig into
definitely.
our inventory. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Mike, your turn. How do you determine the plan? So a child, a learner struggles with one or both of these things. How do you then delineate an instructional plan based on their learning profile?
Yeah, sure. I thought what I would do is just kind of walk you through my typical initial interview with a student, our intake session, as it were. When a parent, family contacts us looking for executive function coaching or tutoring, we set up this initial session. Most of the time, you should know that I primarily work with students in middle school or high school, occasionally college students as well. And so that being said, for the most part, I'm able to just chat with the student. And then usually mom or dad or both are able to join during the last 10 or 15 minutes of our time together, where we kind of go over what we talked about and the plan that we put down. So the way I approach this initial interview, I want to really put myself in their shoes. They're meeting with this guy, obviously because they're not doing well in school and they need help, and right. So they're already more than likely a little uneasy, a little nervous about the situation. At least that can often be the case. So the first thing I do, I just listen. I try to get them talking. I try to get them to tell me their story. Basically, I ask, can you just walk me through your day of school? Like, what's a typical day? What's first period? Oh, I go to English. Okay, tell me about English. Do you like English? Is it fun? Is it, no, it's really hard. I have a hard time reading. Okay, tell me more about that. Tell me more, tell me more. I try to keep them talking so that I can, throughout this conversation, I can start to, what I'm listening for are their interests and stressors. Like, what are the things that really, like social studies? Oh my gosh, yeah, I love social studies, great teacher, like, good to know, right? Like, if I can pick up on what they're interested in, I can use that as a gateway to things that are hard for them, right? Like, let's find a way to connect what you're really good at here with where you're challenged here. I'm also trying to pick out stressors, things that stress them out. We know that if students are under a lot of stress, it's really hard for them to engage the frontal lobes and to, use strategies. So I'm trying to like piece that out. And then, Jess, you even use these words too. Like, I'm trying to piece out what are their strengths and what are the real challenges that they have, so that can factor into my approach working with them.
And then they truly feel heard and
Right.
seen. I
Yeah,
totally
yep.
get it. Yeah, because then it's like you've spent the time to get to know them. You've developed a little credibility and rapport. A relationship goes a long way. And then, executive functioning, it's one of those, I think all skills are hard to really target and hone in on, but executive functioning is just so icky to our students. They can't relate to it. It's not as meaningful, and it's just
Right.
so much stress. So
Yeah.
I appreciate that method of just kind of chiseling away, like that iceberg example, and getting to the bottom of it and looking at those areas of need as areas of opportunity.
Yeah. I will perhaps oversimplify executive functions to some students by saying it's the brain's ability to get things done. And I just want to help you find ways to get your work done, get organized, and just kind of reduce stress, all that kind of stuff.
Feel more successful. Yeah.
And then this is actually a good segue, because the second piece to this approach is, after I've listened, I immediately try to find ways to boost their confidence. To let them know you're not alone. I hear what you're saying. Like let them be heard. I hear what you're saying, and I've helped other students through similar things, and believe in them. Try to get them to believe in themselves so that they feel empowered to kind of make some changes. And then we start making a plan. And the way I approach this is I use these 4 different categories. First is materials and environment, organizing the system that they use to keep their papers organized. Maybe talking about, where do you do your work? Like, do you have a desk in your room? Do you work at the kitchen table? Or, and talk about their working environment in the home. And then we'll talk about time management. And I usually put that into 2 categories: planning and productivity. So planning is all the like preparation and making a plan, and then productivity is like following through, like actually getting focused, getting started, initiation, task initiation, getting started. And then the third category is just academic strategies or study strategies, like using effective strategies to actually study for tests, follow directions, take organized notes, things of that nature. And then the last category, we call personal growth. It's an opportunity for us to explore goal setting. And it's also an opportunity for me to say to the student, okay, so we've mapped out a few things that we're going to work on, using a planner more and getting organized and working on study strategies. What's missing? Like, what do you want to work on? And that often goes in our little personal growth section of the plan.
I love that. I love that. It's so much better than I used to use healthy habits. But kids push back on that. You don't get much ownership around that accountability. That's awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you for that breakdown. I
Sure.
so appreciate it. It's such full of great reminders for me as a specialist too. So we're going to go through one top strategy per panelist. So maybe 1 or 2 minutes each, just because we're running a little low on time, but this is such important information that I don't necessarily want to cut you short. So let's try to just pick one. I know it's so hard as an ed spec myself, but just one top strategy that you'd recommend to caregivers and educators alike. We'll start with Georgia, then Sheila, then Mike.
There was a question posed by a person in Scotland. So hello to Scotland. That is very germane to my answer. My answer is to encourage teachers to provide structured systems of classroom structure, classroom environment, time management, and materials management for the entire class. What I'm getting at is the importance of looking at executive functions as a positive. You know, Jess rattled off the dysgraphia, dyslexia, dys. You know, kids who are diagnosed, and ADHD feels like that too, right? They tend to absorb this medical model that's very pathologically based. And the more teachers can look at executive functions from a positive light, they are supports. There's not a single dis in there. and absorb it into normal practice, the better for everybody, even and especially perhaps the kids who are diagnosed. I'm sorry, that was a long-winded response.
Nope, it was perfect. All-inclusive model. I'm all about it. It's true. If you teach the whole class, right, then we're definitely going to, it's a wide enough net. But it also helps them feel like they're part of the group, like they're seen.
That's right. And it takes away that stigma that, oh, you need special materials and you need a special schedule. And, you know, which as kids become more aware, which is around 3rd grade, that's just like a stake in the heart.
Yeah.
In terms of their self-esteem. And the truth is, it's unnecessary at that level because all the kids need this.
Totally agree. That was a great point. Sheila?
So I agree 100% wholeheartedly about this structure and organization, but I also challenge parents and educators to create the lessons that don't have one right answer, that aren't structured, that aren't a fail or not fail. They're really inquiry based. And so you're teaching grit. You're teaching students that failure isn't a horrific thing, that we all fail, we pick ourselves up, we do it again, we try, we teach that, you know, that lesson in life that with the growth mindset, right? Like, I haven't learned this yet. I can't do this yet. I haven't figured this out yet. And so you're really teaching the students a way of thinking, because one of the number one things with students with ADHD and EF challenges is that they don't get started on anything. Well, number one, 9 times out of 10, it's not a preferred task because it's probably being taught in a boring traditional method. And the other thing is that it's not engaging. And they've failed so many times that they don't want to start something they're fearing they're failing, and they're going to fail. So they predict their own failure before they start. So they think, why do I bother starting? So that would be my piece of it.
You know, I so appreciate your comment, and it strikes a chord with Mike and I did a teacher workshop this morning, and one of the participants asked us, well, isn't all that structure stifling and stifling to the teacher and the kids? So Sheila, it isn't, of course, because you're talking about 2 different things. You're talking about structured environment, which actually releases mental energy to be more open in your thinking and more wide-based in the way you regard kids. So Sheila, I love that. I think they go together beautifully.
Perfectly, yes.
I am having all sorts of epiphanies over here as an adult. I'm just gonna say it. That was great. Thank you, Sheila. But that was a great reminder that we all need as adults, as learners who struggle, what have you. So I appreciate that. All right, Mike, I know it's so challenging, but what is your one top tip?
Well, I will. This is kind of a recent way of thinking about coaching that has been proving to be pretty effective for me, and it's helping students see the difference between and the relationship between systems and routines. And I think that you need both to be effective and successful. But often one of the two is in place already. And it's just about highlighting that for students. For example, they're having a hard time staying on top of their homework. And so maybe using an assignment notebook, like maybe they've got one, but they're not using it, right? So you've got the system, we just got to work on the routine. Or maybe they have the routine of, yeah, I do write my homework down, but it's always on some like different cards or just whatever piece of paper I have. So they've got the routine, like they're in the habit of writing it down. That's great. But now what you need is a better system. So, right. And so if I can help students identify the fact that you're halfway there, like you're actually halfway there, we just need to figure out a better system, or often it's, a better routine, that you have the system, you've got the folders. Let's really work on using them, and build that routine. And we start small, right? Start like, let's just focus on math, or something. Just kind of pick one subject, especially if students feel really overwhelmed. But that I've been having some success with that, having students kind of identify the relationship between a system and a routine, and try to highlight when one of them is in place already. That helps them, gives them a little boost.
Totally. Start with the positive and build from there. Then they feel more successful from the start. Right. That was a great point. I'm like, oh yeah, I need better systems to have great routines or what have you. That's great. Okay. Again, another challenge for the expert panelists, but if you could give just one piece of advice, like your final thought, what would you say, starting with Georgia?
Well, this is going to sound a little strange. When I talk with caregivers, I always tell them the most important thing is the relationship with their child. That, of course, they need to be advocates. Of course, they do. Mm-hmm. And they need to know the very things that we're talking about. But in the long run, I mentioned the age of my own children, right? And as I reflect to some extent on parental practices and all the caregivers that I've worked with over the years, to me, the critical piece is that you keep the relationship intact. And what does that mean? It means you appreciate the strengths, you share together experiences that you both enjoy, that you watch yourself on nagging, pull back on that. And as Sheila talked about, you look at practices related to growth mindset, to encouragement without being saccharine, without seeming Pollyannish, right? Talking about things that you genuinely appreciate about them, and encouragement that's very specific in that way. But it's all, here I am again talking about relationships, right? It's all about maintaining the relationship with your child, because over time, that's really all that matters. Yeah. As a caregiver, a long-term caregiver.
Oh, I so value you saying that, again, as a reminder for myself, but also as a reminder for all the caregivers in the room, that oftentimes I think, especially for those who have some training or understanding in this area, we try to teach our own kids, and it can sever the relationship, right? And it messes with the family dynamic. And for some kids, not all, nothing is for all. No. But it's really important to know that relationship is at the core of everything you do as a caregiver and an educator. Starting with that is really powerful. So thank you. That was great. Okay, Sheila, you got to follow that.
Yeah. The one piece of advice that I feel really strongly about is empowering your child. So you're building a relationship, but you're also teaching them how to advocate for themselves through really being a mindful listener. I really feel strongly that almost at almost any age, having a child in the room when you're talking about them and what their needs are, even if it's only for a part of a meeting, asking them, what subjects do you like the best? How do you learn the best? What part of day is the best for you? And having the other educators, having educators in the room to listen, that, when you do this and this and this, I don't understand, or I can't get it, or whatever it might be. And so really having them be part of the conversation. And always, you have to be their advocate. Always.
Yeah,
We
and
make the
modeling.
assumption that educators are trained in all of these DISs. They're not. They aren't specialists in all of them. They may not be specialists in any of them, or have had students that they've engaged with any of these challenges in the past. And so you can't make that assumption. And so the gift is you and your child could be a support to help other kids in the future. But that only happens with the relationship and dialogue and really empowering their voice, because they can feel so powerless when they're in these classrooms not understanding what's going on. It really does shrink them down into the corner. And the only one that's going to be able to build them up is probably you.
And modeling that for them so they feel empowered to
Right.
then replicate it. That was great, Sheila. Thank you. Okay, Mike, final thoughts.
Okay. So mine is easier said than done. And it's as simple as lead by example, to walk the walk and really share, open up with this is how I keep things organized or don't, right? Like to share, this is what works for me. This is what I really struggle with. And to just be open as a human, not just as the authority figure or the teacher or the coach or the tutor, but like, hey, I have a hard time with this, and here's what helps me, and here's, and let's find what will work for you. And I think the more we can share the little unique strategies that we as professionals have developed that work for us, just in terms of keeping things organized, planning things out, little strategies we've developed over our professional lives, like find ways to connect those to what your students are going through. And I think what that does is it shows them that it starts to broaden their scope. It's not just about school. It's about like, this is how I kind of navigate life and getting things done. And, I remember having a conversation with a student who's like, when am I ever going to need this? Talking about calculus or some sort of math. And I was like, yeah, I don't know, but I'll tell you this, you will always have to do things that you don't really want to do. So let's focus on that. Maybe like we got to get through this, right? You got to try to pass this class. So rather than worrying about like the quadratic equation and how that's ever going to fit into my life, well, you're going to have to do taxes, and that's hard.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, I used to have a mentor back in California who would say we need to teach learners that it's not about passing the test, but passing the test of life, right? So if they go through the class, it's not necessarily just like, let's pass the class and move on. It's like those are chiseling those classes. Each individual class is actually building a bigger picture.
That's right.
And so working through non-preferred tasks and disengaging activities and things like that. I mean, I say all the time, there's paperwork I have to do every day that I don't necessarily love doing, but I need to actually be able to do it and be somewhat good at it. So I think that's huge for learners to know and to validate, right? Like we have struggled with this before. I even still struggle with some of these things. I think also modeling the trail, like helping them go back and pick up their stuff and little things like that just reinforce the behaviors, I think is so helpful. So thank you, 3. That was amazing. I'm so grateful for your advice. We're going to be brief. I know we're out of time. But Learnfully services, just so you all know, I'll do this as quickly as I can. We have a Spark learning assessment that we usually administer at the beginning alongside a caregiver questionnaire to ensure that we're looking at that from the caregiver's lens, sometimes the teacher lens as well. And then we're pinpointing where that breakdown is happening in terms of the underlying sensory cognitive functions, but also the application thereof in areas such as literacy and math. And then after we do that aptitude and assessment, we then break it down and present a consultation and a learning plan to the caregiver and anyone else who wants to join us. We really love collaborating. So if anybody else wants to join that consultation, we welcome it. We walk through the recommendations, the plan, the duration, the program. We are agnostic to a specific program. We recommend the program that we feel is in the best interest of the learner. And then we find the specialist who can provide it. If they already have an assessment, because that happens quite often, if they just had an IEP, they have a neuropsych in hand, whatever, if they just have an assessment, then we can use that as a file review and get started and then sprinkle in the Spark assessment for progress monitoring purposes at a later point. So fear not. We've already talked about this, so I'll just review. We offer educational therapy, executive functioning coaching primarily, and we offer flexible formats. So we see learners online, we see them in person, we can see them as a hybrid model. If you are a caregiver who works really well with their learner, with your child, then we could do parent-led. We have an executive functioning boot camp class that is one session as a group and one session one-on-one throughout a month. Each month is a targeted focus. So there's lots of possibilities here based on how your learner learns best and what will really engage them in the process from the beginning. Sometimes that takes a one-on-one, but sometimes that takes a social learning environment where they all feel like they're part of a cohort. So based on the need, we would make recommendations and then proceed. So this is LDA month. We want to make sure you have a list of resources in terms of how you can get involved. There's lots of opportunities here in terms of diving into the research and digging into the resources, but also volunteer opportunities. The IDA has chapters regionally or locally, so you can look into those, and you can obviously volunteer at any of these organizations. But we will share these with you too with the recordings, so don't feel like you have to jot them all down. And that does it for us. I am so grateful that you three were here with me. This is a wonderful discussion. I have a feeling we'll be meeting again. There's so much to say, but I'm so grateful for what you did say. We tried to keep it concise. We know it's a very dynamic topic, and we are open to questions later on. I will make sure that you have everyone's contact information, and you can reach out as needed. Email us, call us, text us, follow us on socials. Whatever is in your best interest. We are happy to have you as part of our community. Thanks, everyone. We hope to see you in November for our next 2 webinars. Take care.